All right, so get ready because today we're diving deep into the sneaky ways governments try and influence how we act.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you know it's going to be a lot more than just laws and taxes, right?
Yep.
So we're going deep on this thing called the intervention ladder. It's a concept from behavioral science and reveals like this whole spectrum of approaches governments use.
Interesting.
We're actually getting all of this from this interview
Okay.
with a behavioral scientist named Pele Goldborg Hansen.
Okay.
And it was published in the Annual Review of Public Health
Gotcha.
back in 2016.
Okay.
But it's crazy how, like, relevant this stuff all still is today.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that this ladder, like, it's not just some theory that academics made up.
Yeah.
It's really like a framework that governments all over the world use to actually tackle real problems, you know?
Oh, wow.
Like, think about public health initiatives or getting people to pay their taxes on time.
All right.
Encouraging people to, like, be more eco-friendly.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
So instead of just thinking like, oh, the government does this, the government does that.
Yeah.
We're going to break down like the actual types of actions that they take.
Exactly.
Well, it's like a playbook.
Yeah, a playbook. And, like, if we understand this playbook better,
Yeah.
it can help us all be a little bit more informed citizens.
Yeah.
Like, we can analyze the choices our government's making,
Right.
like what kind of impact that might have on us.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. Let's start breaking down this intervention ladder.
Sure.
So is it like, are some of these rungs more intense than others?
I think that's a really good way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like climbing a staircase of influence, and each rung is like,
Okay.
you know, a more forceful approach.
I'm ready to climb.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Okay. Yeah.
So what's like the first step?
Well, the very first rung might surprise you.
Okay.
It's actually doing nothing.
Doing nothing.
And sometimes, even though there's a problem, right? The best way to go about it is to wait and see. Like, especially if you intervene, it might just make things worse.
Yeah.
Do more harm than good.
You know, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like, if you rush into doing something
Yeah.
without really knowing what the issue is,
Right.
it could backfire pretty bad.
Totally.
Are there, like, any current examples of this doing nothing approach?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Like, take this whole debate around regulating social media, right?
Right. Yeah.
Some people say that, like, trying to intervene now,
Yeah.
it's just too early.
Hmm.
They think it'd be better to just see how the technology evolves
Right.
before you start imposing all these restrictions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because then you might stifle innovation or
Yeah.
free speech.
Wow. Yeah. That's a super relevant example.
It is.
So doing nothing, I'm seeing now, it can definitely be a valid option sometimes.
For sure.
But let's say action is actually needed.
Yeah.
What's the next rung up on the ladder?
Well, next up is information.
Information?
Governments will often try to just influence people by giving them facts
Okay.
and raising awareness.
I see. So it's like, here's the information.
Yeah.
Now you make an informed choice.
Right.
I'm assuming like a classic example is those smoking kills campaigns.
You got it.
Yeah.
Those campaigns are like all about educating people on how bad smoking is for you, right?
Yeah.
And they hope that that knowledge will make people not want to smoke
Yeah.
or encourage them to quit.
Right.
But, you know, as we
Yeah.
all know, information alone,
Right.
it doesn't always work
Yeah.
to change people's behavior.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a gap between knowing something and actually doing something, you know?
Exactly.
So what happens when just giving people the facts isn't enough?
Then you got to move up the ladder
Okay.
to persuasion,
Persuasion. Okay. Okay.
which is a lot more about appealing to people's emotions and values.
So less, here are the cold, hard facts,
Right.
and more like, let me tug at your heartstrings a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, think about anti-smoking campaigns
Okay.
that show you, like, really vividly how much people suffer from smoking-related illnesses.
Right.
Or they highlight, like, how secondhand smoke affects your loved ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's about making people care, you know?
Yeah, like hitting them in the feels.
Exactly.
But I imagine even that has its limits, right?
it does.
People can be pretty stubborn.
Yeah.
So what happens when you need more than just a heartfelt plea?
Well, then you got to bring in the incentives.
It's incentives.
This is about creating systems that encourage people to do the things you want them to do
Okay.
and discourage them from doing the things you don't want them to do.
Right.
And it usually involves appealing to people's self-interest
Right.
because Humans are pretty predictable in a lot of ways.
So, like the classic carrot and stick approach.
You got it.
Is this where behavioral economics comes in?
Absolutely.
With all those like weird biases and heuristics you were talking about before?
Yeah, incentives tap right into that. Those predictable patterns in human behavior.
Right.
Like, we know, for example, that people are more motivated to avoid losing something than they are to gain something of the same value.
Interesting.
It's called loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
And it explains why, like, taxes on cigarettes work so well.
Right.
Because they make smoking feel like a financial loss.
That makes total sense. So like a tax break for installing solar panels, that would be using that desire for gain, right?
Exactly.
And then like a sugar tax plays on our aversion to loss.
Yeah, you're getting it.
Clever.
But it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
There are times when even incentives aren't enough to really change people's behavior in a big way.
I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah.
Sounds like we're about to get into serious measures territory.
You're right about that. That's when you get to the top of the ladder.
Okay.
Legislation.
Ah, legislation.
Yeah, this is where governments take the most forceful approach, using laws and regulations to like directly control how people act.
Okay, so we're talking about things like, setting a legal drinking age.
Right.
Banning smoking in public places.
Exactly.
Or even like mandating that everyone has to wear a seatbelt.
Exactly, yeah.
Those sorts of things.
Those are all examples of legislation to protect,
right.
public health and safety.
Right.
But, as you can imagine, this level of intervention,
right.
it often triggers the most resistance.
Yeah, I can imagine people. People tend to get a lot more riled up when there's a law that restricts what they can do compared to, if they just get an informational pamphlet.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Because, like, legislation comes with penalties and ways to enforce it. You break the law. Yeah. You might get fined.
Right.
You might get into legal trouble.
Yeah.
You might even go to jail in some cases.
Right.
So the stakes are a lot higher.
Okay, so we've climbed all the way up this intervention ladder from doing nothing at all to full-blown legislation.
Yeah.
It's a pretty comprehensive framework for understanding how governments try to influence how we behave, right?
It really is. And, it's important to keep in mind that governments often use more than one approach at the same time. Like they might do an information campaign along with incentives. Yeah. Or they might use nudges to try and make their laws work better.
Right, okay.
So it's not always just one thing.
Like a multi-pronged attack on bad behavior.
You could say that, Joe.
But you mentioned nudges earlier.
I did.
And I gotta admit, that's what I'm most curious about.
Okay.
It seems a little more, subtle? And maybe even a little sneaky than some of the other approaches.
I can see why you'd say that.
Yeah.
Nudges are all about understanding, like those quirks that people have in their psychology, and using that to kind of gently steer them towards making the choices you want them to make.
So it's less about forcing someone to do something and more about like subtly making it easier.
Exactly.
Or more appealing for them to choose that, I guess, right path.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And what's great about nudges is they can be really effective without being too bossy or restrictive.
Can you give me like an example of a nudge?
Sure.
I'm having trouble like picturing how that works in real life.
Okay, let's think about smoking again.
Okay.
Imagine a government's trying to get people to stop smoking. Right?
Yeah.
They could increase the tax on cigarettes.
Oh.
That's the incentive part.
Right.
But then they could also nudge people by like putting e-cigarettes right next to the register.
Okay, so instead of just punishing smokers with a higher price, you're also making it super easy for them to see and, think about a less harmful alternative.
Exactly. The nudge is that little extra push.
Right.
That takes advantage of the fact that people tend to just choose.
Yeah.
Whatever's easiest and most right in front of them.
That's so fascinating.
It is.
It's like you're playing a mind game with people.
Yeah.
But in a way that could help their health.
Right.
But I bet not everyone is happy about this whole idea of the government nudging us.
Oh, for sure not.
Even if it's for our own good.
Right.
Yeah.
There are definitely some criticisms about using nudges.
Right.
Some people worry that it's like a form of manipulation, or that it gives the government too much power to influence our choices without us really agreeing to it.
It's like, where do you draw the line between helpful guidance and like sneaky control?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tricky.
It is, and it's a debate worth having.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that nudging isn't about controlling what people think.
Right.
Or forcing them to make specific decisions.
Okay.
It's more about understanding how our minds work and then designing environments that make it easier for us to choose what's actually in our best interest.
So, like, you're not taking away anyone's freedom to choose. You're just, I don't know, kind of tilting the playing field a bit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
It's about making the healthy or desirable choice.
Right.
The easy choice.
This is all so thought-provoking.
Good.
I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way.
Ah.
Yeah.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
But I think it's time that we talk about those criticisms of nudging a little more directly.
Right.
Because they are important concerns.
Yeah, they really are. All right, let's get into those criticisms of nudging then.
Okay.
'Cause it sounds like there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the main concerns people have?
Well, one big one is that nudging is just a way for governments to, like, get out of taking real action. You know, instead of actually enacting tough regulations or making, like, these big policy. They're just using these little psychology tricks to make it seem like they're doing something.
So it's like a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah.
Instead of actually fixing the root cause.
That's the argument. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's a little oversimplified. You know, nudging can be really powerful when it's used correctly.
Okay.
Especially for those, like, behavioral problems where the traditional ways of doing things just haven't worked.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by behavioral problems?
Sure. Think about saving for retirement.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we all know logically that we should be saving.
Right.
But a lot of us just don't actually do it.
Yeah.
There's this gap between what we want to do and what we actually end up doing.
Oh, tell me about it. My retirement fund could use a nudge, for sure.
Right. And that's where nudges can come in.
Yeah.
Instead of just telling people to save more,
which
we know doesn't always work.
Right.
You can just make it easier for them to actually do it. Like, for example, automatically enrolling people in a retirement savings plan.
Okay, yeah.
Unless they choose to opt out.
Ah, so you're using that, like, our natural tendency to be lazy?
Yeah, or inertia.
Yeah, inertia.
Yeah, that tendency to just stick with whatever the default option is.
Right, just go with the flow.
Exactly.
Clever. But some people would probably still say that's manipulation. Even if it's for our own good.
Yeah, and that's a totally fair point.
Right.
That gets right to the heart of the debate about nudging.
Yeah.
But I think the important question is, like, what's the alternative?
That's a good point. If just giving information isn't enough.
Right.
Or even offering people incentives.
Right.
What else can you really do?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes nudges might be the best way to do it. Like the most effective way.
Okay.
And the least intrusive way.
Right.
To get that outcome that you want.
Okay.
Think about organ donation.
Okay.
In countries where you have to, like, sign up to be a donor, the rates are way lower than in countries where you have to, like, opt out of being a donor.
Oh, wow. So just changing that default option can make a huge difference.
It can. That's the power of nudges. They use, like, the psychology that we already have to help us make choices that are good for us and good for society.
This has been such an interesting conversation.
Good.
It really makes you think about all the choices we make and how those choices are affected by everything around us.
It really does. And that's what's so cool about behavioral science.
Yeah.
It shows us those hidden things that shape how we act, often without us even knowing it.
So to wrap things up, what's, like, the main takeaway you want our listener to, like, walk away with today?
I think the most important thing is to just be aware of the different ways that governments are trying to influence our behavior.
Okay.
From those subtle nudges to, like, big laws.
Right.
And to remember that none of these approaches are good or bad on their own. It really depends on how they're used.
Right.
And what the government's actually trying to achieve.
Well said. So, dear listener, next time you see, like, a public service announcement or you're at the store and you notice how they've arranged the products.
Right.
Or even when they're debating a new law.
Yeah.
Think about that intervention ladder. Ask yourself, where does this action fall on that spectrum of influence?
Right.
And what are they trying to make happen?
Exactly.
Because, you know, knowledge is power.
It is.
And understanding how these things work can help you make better choices in your own life.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
And keep those brains buzzing.